In 1791, the most profitable colony on Earth erupted. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people rose up, burned their plantations to the ground, and dragged Europe's great powers into a brutal war that would last for more than a decade. And when it was over, the enslaved population won, founding their own sovereign state, something that had never happened before and has never happened since. This is the story of the Haitian Revolution, a violent, complicated conflict that has been pushed to the margins of history. In the 1780s, this French colony called Saint-Domingue was home to 40,000 French people that had rights and privileges that were not given to the 500,000 or so slaves that were working and living on the island. These slaves had been mainly brought over from Africa and put to work on plantations, where their working conditions were miserable. Their work was relentless, their diet was poor, and violence was everywhere. You'd have a hard time finding a worse place to be alive. And this was all ethically horrible, but it made France a shit ton of money. Something like half of the world's sugar and coffee at the time was made from this one small territory, and it was bringing in just a tremendous amount of wealth. For the French, this was a rich, amazing outpost on an island. But then things in 1791 reached a breaking point. Now, during this year, large numbers of slaves started to get together at night in the woods. They would have these voodoo rituals, these like religious ceremonies, and they started to be combined with a political message, which was organizing a general revolt. So then that August, thousands of slaves rose up together and started going on a rampage. The French tried to get things back under control, but the revolt spread really quickly, and these large numbers of slaves start organizing themselves into legitimate armies. They secure weapons, they learn European battle tactics that they blend with guerrilla activities, and they put up a hell of a fight. And as this was gaining momentum, the Spanish get involved. The Spanish owned the other part of the island of Hispaniola, which was called Santo Domingo. And so they wanted to take the whole island for themselves. So they start supplying the slave armies with weapons in exchange for their freedom under the Spanish crown. They identified the best leaders in the ranks of this newly freed slave army and integrated them within the Spanish army. Now, one of these formidable people that was identified as a rising military star was named Toussaint L'Ouverture. I've seen him compared to Napoleon, Spartacus, and George Washington. So make of those comparisons as you will. He was born a slave, and he really wouldn't be involved in politics or the military until his late 40s. But he found out he was really, really, really good at those things. After he started working with the Spanish, he found it to be a bad fit. And that's because L'Ouverture was a visionary. He was working towards an idealistic future for Saint-Domingue. In his life, he had been a slave, he had been free, he had owned slaves, he was friends with blacks, he was friends with whites, rich and poor. So he had a unique, holistic perspective on the situation. And this perspective had him thinking about the future that he wanted to build for the island. He wasn't as concerned with retributions. He was concerned with abolishing slavery and building a place that was independent, ethical, wealthy, educated, and thriving. And he didn't see a way to get there through the Spanish, so he switched sides and started supporting the French as a double agent. That decision was made easier for him because at the time, in 1794, the French National Convention had just abolished slavery, and Toussaint could work with that. He became good friends with the new governor of the colony, and he put his military genius to work by getting the French a little breathing room. Over the next half-decade, there would be a new phase of the revolution, where Toussaint L'Ouverture would push out the European nations trying to take a piece of the colony, and he would quell the population internally. And he started developing a working relationship with the French that put him as the de facto decision-maker for the colony. Every year after this point, he consolidated a little more power, and he took a little more autonomy. He started brokering deals with other nations like the United States and the British without consulting the French at all. And by the year 1800, he was getting to be so powerful that he invaded the territory of Santo Domingo, Spanish side of the island, and freed the slaves working there. Then he wrote a new constitution for the colony. At this point, it was getting harder to believe that Saint-Domingue was actually under French control, and that it was not in reality run by Toussaint L'Ouverture personally. And that signaled the final phase of the revolution, because the fact of L'Ouverture's rise scared another rising star across the Atlantic, who had a very vested interest in the colony, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon did not share the same vision for Saint-Domingue, and was much more concerned about the financial situation of the colony than its human rights record. And so in 1802, Napoleon sent over an army of 30,000 men to go re-establish slavery. He put his brother-in-law, named Charles Leclerc, in charge of the mission. They obviously knew that these revolutionaries were not going to be thrilled with the idea of being slaves again. So they tried to be a little sneaky. First, they would take Louverture out of the way and try to get the population more docile, and then they would spring the bad news on them. Well, things turned out not to be that easy. It got really ugly from the minute the French forces landed on the island. The French had a hell of a time with the terrain, and they struggled against the more mobile revolutionary armies, even though they had superior numbers and better weaponry. Additionally, they got annihilated by yellow fever. Toussaint L'Ouverture had some brilliant moments in this campaign, and he was able to drag out the fighting for a while, even with inferior resources. But he was abandoned by his allies, and he saw his fighting force shrinking before his eyes. By spring, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire. And just when Toussaint L'Ouverture let his guard down, the French laid a trap for him. When he was unguarded and vulnerable, they had him captured and sent away to France. He would meet his end in a cold cell in a castle in the mountains the next year in 1803. Now, with Toussaint L'Ouverture gone, the true intentions of the French became crystal clear. And rather than letting the French reestablish slavery, Toussaint's former men gathered around his top general, named Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and fought back with more gusto than ever before. And by this time, yellow fever was really taking a toll on the French. They lost more men and more territory by the month, and eventually the French had nothing left to fight with. 85% of the French that was sent there would be killed and not make it back home. By 1803, the remaining French had to surrender and leave, and by 1804, Dessalines proclaimed independence for his people, stating that the territory would return to its native name of Haiti. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, it'd be really great if you could like and subscribe. I hope to see you next time. Bye.